My name is Alana, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Jessie. I use she, her pronouns.
And we're making menches.
Making Menches is your home for queer, anti-Zionist Jewish ritual, radical education, and community.
Today, we are talking to Eliana Rubin about their new book, Taking the State Out of the Body, A Guide to Embodied Resistance to Zionism. Eliana builds transgressive relationships with bodies, land, and lineage through their work as a somatic practitioner, politicized facilitator, anti-Zionist organizer, full-spectrum doula, land steward, and queer pleasure instigator. They run a somatic facilitation practice with Sanctuary Embodied aimed at resourcing organizers in developing embodied leadership and power for movements for justice. Eliana, welcome. We are so excited to have you. To start, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work?
Hi, happy to be here. I am currently in Durham, North Carolina on Eno, Shikori, and Okanichi land. I grew up in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, California, on Ohlone, Choqueño land. And both of these lands have really deeply shaped me and my work, and the communities and people and plants and animals of those places. And I'm here because I'm really in this beautiful niche world and intersections that we occupy as queer anti-Zionist organizers. And I'm just grateful to be in community with y'all.
Thank you. We're excited to have you. For listeners who might not have read your book yet or who don't engage with somatics, could you give a little background about what somatics is?
I think somatics has become somewhat of a buzzword or more popular in recent years. And in a way, as with many things, as they get mainstream, there's like the benefits of things growing at scale, and then there's the mainstreaming that happens. And I think with somatics, our definition of somatics has become more narrow in that popularity to be a practice of like self-care or body-based tools. And I really think about somatics as quite simply like how we align our bodies with our actions, our behaviors, our relationships. In a similar way that I think about politics. Like people are like, oh, like what are that person's politics? I don't think about that in just an intellectual way of like, what do they think about or theorize about? But like, how do they treat their people? What is their relationship with the land? What is their relationship with community? So I think embodied practice is really about building the tools to create more choice and agency. So it's not to say that there's anything wrong with us or that we are broken or some of the other ways that I think the like self-help or healing industrial complex might have us think about healing in a capitalist framework of like, we are here and we need to get somewhere else. But actually just to get curious and be like, oh, how did I get here? What are the shapes that I've taken on to protect myself? What's the wisdom of those shapes? And then where do and don't those align with what I care about? So somatics really helps like close that gap where we're like, oh, I really, for example, it's like, oh, I really want more intimacy and connection in my life, but actually the way that I've been shaped by trauma or whiteness or other internalized oppression is keeping me from that longing, is keeping me from connection because I actually like curl away from that in the face of vulnerability. So yeah, I think somatics is embodiment, is everything, is how we are in the world.
Thank you so much for that. And that is one of the hardest lessons I think for me personally to learn is that like the way we are in our body, that's how we are in the world, and that's how the world is in us, and it's rough. And I'm so curious because your book, it's so incredible at making this connection. When did you begin to connect somatics with anti-Zionism specifically?
So I was really lucky to be in community with folks who really had already made those connections. I was organizing with the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network when I started training with generative somatics. And there was a lot of overlap in some of the leadership with the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. And so my entry into somatics was always rooted in anti-Zionism and anti-imperialism. So in that way, I really got to inherit those traditions and legacies of resistance and resilience in this lineage of somatics that I came into. And of course, one of the reasons I really pursued somatics was from a place of doing a lot of political organizing, Palestine solidarity work, also in my full spectrum doula work, doing a lot of reproductive justice organizing, and then also having this really deep interest and commitment to healing and body work, and was studying herbs and medicine and all these different things. And I just could really feel the fissure, the splits between those places and how much they needed each other. That without a political framework, healing was kind of insufficient. It was so many of the things that we're facing are collective trauma, are collective experiences of violence, harm, oppression. And so in that way, the healing needs to also be collective and needs to also be politicized. And then in political spaces, being oh, wow, and particularly around Jews moving other Jews, whether that's in family or community or organizing spaces, that watching, it's oh, when we're engaging, when we're trying to move people who have been indoctrinated into Zionism to believe that the way that for Jews to be safe is through a nation state, we're talking to their safety systems. We're not talking to their intellect or their ideas. We need to know how to talk to finding safety in the body. And so I became really curious about that in my own community and in healing intergenerational trauma, to look at these intersections of how could embodied safety actually be a challenge to militarized borders, policing, and nationalism.
Thank you so much. Not to fangirl for a second, but I need to fangirl for a second. Absolutely loved your book so much. Not just saying that because we have you on the podcast. Every part of it, I was like, oh my God, this is brilliant. And the sections that talked about the ways that we can engage with our bodies and embodiment in opposition to Zionism were so juicy and amazing. Um, so I'm excited to talk more about that too. The plants and body parts you chose to focus on in this book are all tied to specific concepts related to political somatics and Jewish ancestral trauma. Calendula, redwoods, fascia, vagus nerve, oak, and mycelia. How did you decide upon these and the order in which they appeared in the book?
There's so many pieces of this question. The order is making me smile a little bit, because I originally, when I was in more of the creative process of writing, I wrote a table of contents and I wrote it in a circle, because I was I don't know what's the beginning and what's the end. And the publishing world is a little more linear. So the table of contents is now in order, but I don't actually feel attached to that order, because sort of the point of the book is all of these things feed into each other and are interacting in different ways. But the specific sort of allegories, analogies at the beginning of each part were plant and or body parts that felt like guides in understanding some of the principles of each of those chapters. So, for example, calendula is more of one of the more direct connections. Calendula was a flower that was worn in the Netherlands during the Nazi genocide to symbolize safe houses and places for Jews to find safety amidst persecution. And so that felt like finding that out felt like such a beautiful coming together. I think I actually learned that when I was working on a farm in Northern California, and had like quarter of an acre of calendula growing, like so many flowers in bloom, and would collect the seeds every year. And it was the first seed that I learned to save, which felt like a really powerful embodied practice of like intergenerational resilience. And so learning that was really, I was like, oh, calendula has to be in the book, and is the flower that Roan, who did the cover art, drew on the front. So that's a really special one. And then, yeah, the others are like redwoods, growing up around a lot of redwoods. I got to learn both from the trees themselves and from books about the ways that they are interconnected, the ways that they reach towards each other when a tree needs healing, like quite literally will like send nutrients to another tree. And that way of like mutual aid, interconnection, collectivity feels like such a key tool for us in these times, who, particularly those of us, many of us impacted by dominant cultures of capitalism and white supremacy, live in so much individualism. And there's just no distinction in redwood trees. Like, they are the collective. And when one dies, a ring grows around them of new, it's just like, yeah, connection in every direction through time and place. I won't go through all of them, but I'll say one more. The vagus nerve was something that I learned about in more of my deeper studies. So after training with generative somatics and other embodied facilitation tools like theater of the oppressed and things like that, I was like, I actually want to like geek out more on all of these things. And I did a master's program at Goddard. We're just starting a master's in embodiment studies, which, yes, is slash was a thing. So I got to, yeah, just deep dive more into like polyvagal theory and other things that were part of the like canon of politicized somatics. And the vagus nerve in particular felt like such the kind of learning that is so much about unlearning too. It was like, oh, I've been taught that the nervous system is this like binary, that our bodies are binary, right? That our bodies are supposed to be these like sterile, symmetrical things. And that when it comes to survival responses, there's so much stigma, right? It's like fight or flight and PTSD, and like sort of has this very linear, definitive view on our bodies and our experiences of trauma. And the vagus nerve, basically the research around polyvagal theory added a third branch to our understandings of the nervous system to say there's actually a whole social engagement system, which is how we take cues from other people and how actually our nervous systems are connected to each other and cueing for safety all the time from not just other people, but also like our spaces and the sounds we hear and things like that. And then the other significant piece of research from that was also about the dorsal vagus nerve. So ventral vagal is that social engagement system and being able to be present and connected in your body. And then the dorsal vagal nerve is the shutdown, is the freeze response. And I just felt like, so it's rather than just fight or flight, we now have the understanding of freeze, and that's happening actually in a whole other system of the body where it's like, oh, I've tried to fight, I've tried to run, neither of those worked, and I'm shutting down, which I think in the times that we're in is a really important one to know, because there's so much pressure and there's so much constant onslaught. I mean, like pandemic, living through a genocide, in the rise of fascism, and we're trying to fight and we're trying to escape, and it's like kind of just getting worse in a lot of ways. And so I've been noticing in my own body and in other people's bodies that just the shutdown is so real. But to have a framework that really destigmatizes that and understands like these are just different parts of our bodies and ways that we learn to keep ourselves safe. And that, going back to what we were talking about earlier, like through embodied practice, whatever that is, it doesn't have to be somatics. It could be, many of the ways that different lineages find embodied practice through time, but that through that sort of awareness, breath, movement, we're able to bring that agency back to notice, oh, I'm frozen. Is that serving me? Maybe. Could be. Or do I want to make a different move? Do I need to shake that off and re-enter and re-engage in some way? So yeah, lots of love to all those different plant and body parts that are in the book.
Wow. Sometimes Alana and I have moments where like we forget we're part of the like interview, like we're just like listening. And that was the one where I was like, wow, this is such a good episode. And I'm like, oh, right, next question. But you kind of already demonstrated this with your last answer, that this book is so full of wisdom and every single part feels so deeply researched as well. And like just listening to you talk, you're seamlessly like weaving in your experience and this research that's like very scientific and could be very hard for people to understand, but like you break it down so well. So, how long did it take you to write this book, and what was the process of writing it like?
Yeah, it took a long time. I didn't really go through school in any traditional way, and I didn't set out to write a book. So I had a very winding journey to about 7 years of writing and research. And I think the first draft of it I finished in February. There's very auspicious timeline. I finished in February of 2020, right before March of 2020. And when the pandemic hit, I was just like, I mean, talk about an embodied response. I was like, okay, I'm not in like sit and edit and have really like present focused attention mode. I'm in like keep my people safe, keep my body safe mode. And so there were periods of time that I kind of put the book down. And I think those times also really contributed to the depth of the book and my relationship to it. Because in each of those moments, it was like, okay, now let me go back through of like the pandemic fundamentally changed how we were understanding our bodies in relationship to each other and safety. I was like, I cannot not talk about that in this book. And then I submitted the final manuscript to PM Press on October 4th of 2023. And of course, then October 7th happened and our world was changed, and both in terms of the level of violence and loss and suffering in Palestine, and also in terms of the level of resistance and visibility of our movements in the US and around the world in solidarity with Palestine. So I went back through and begged them to let me update it before it came out. Because again, I was like, I can't talk about these things without talking about how much clearer in a way I think it's become, at least for more people, and especially people who weren't paying attention before, the connections between Zionism and anti-Semitism and white nationalism and the ways that like this sort of domination over the body, over land, cuts across all of these systems of violence. So it's been a very long journey to try to distill things that have been both like so full of history and depth and knowledge, but also so full of grief and loss and pain. And to write through that took a lot of returning. There are many times I wanted to let it go and had to fortify myself and turn to the people I feel connected to and accountable to be like, do we still need this? Do I need to do this? And kept getting a resounding yes. And yeah, the one other piece I always am thinking about with questions like this about just the writing process is I wrote almost the whole book to a soundtrack of whale sounds. They're in the acknowledgments of the book, but that was like the way that I was able to metabolize grief and information and process and move from all of that input to actually create something. I was like, I need something that is so massive and so connected across time and place. And what better creature than the whales who move with such grace and collectivity and deep wisdom.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that sounds like an absolutely wild journey of writing. And I just want to say, I can't even imagine like finishing something and then having to go back and be like, oh, wait, it's actually not done. And I actually have to add this in every part of this. But like it feels flawlessly done. Like it doesn't feel choppy. It doesn't feel like they were afterthoughts. Like it feels like they were always part of the book, which I think just like speaks to your expertness in being able to write all of these pieces together. But also like I think a lot of other authors like wouldn't have gone back and done that and would have just been like, well, the time has passed and it is what it is and I'm done, so it's done. And like I don't know, I just really appreciated that like you were intentional about going back and including those pieces, because I think they were of course so important and like really made the book like very powerful and like very timely. This is sort of like going in another direction a little bit, getting more into like the meat and potatoes of the actual content of the book. But in chapter 1, you talk about how anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment aren't the same thing, citing the example of the Star of David. This topic has been really important to some anti-Zionist Jews recently, considering whether it's ethical to wear the Star of David while the state of Israel commits genocide and uses the star on its flag. Do you think there's a way to separate the star from the Israeli state's current use of it?
This question feels like connected to so many other questions too, around just like where are the places where we want to reclaim tradition, where are the places we want to reinvent, where are the places we want to diverge, and then where are the places we want to just let it go and create something new. Actually, just in the last year, I had 3 different people send me pictures of their Star of David necklace, like on the back with Hebrew lettering, and be like, do you know what this says? And I was like, I don't know, I can't see, zoom in, zoom in. They all said Zion on the back. And then everyone's like, okay, great, gonna put that away. So, I mean, one thing, just like I'm a very like materially oriented, I'm like, where did that necklace come from, right? Like so much of our Judaica is created in 48 in Israel, or has some connection to the Zionist entity. Shout out to Narrow Bridge Candles and other groups that are doing an incredible job of creating anti-Zionist Judaica so we can have access to those things. But I think, the symbol, especially because it is on the flag, which is like such a huge part of nationalism, patriotism, such a visible sign of the state of Israel. To me, I'm like, there are so many other symbols, plants, so many other ways that I can connect to my Jewish lineage that haven't been so deeply co-opted and coded with a violent state. And I think, just in the past few years have shifted around this, because I was for a while more on the train of like, well, fuck that. Let's reclaim, like, what the Zionist project shouldn't get to take these parts of our traditions that have long predated the Zion, are thousands and thousands of years older than the state of Israel. Like, we should, assert our right to these things and reclaim them and take them. And maybe I'm just tired, but I think I'm also like, there is a way that actually can contribute to the normalization when we're trying to take these things back and be like, well, actually, it's okay. Actually, it's okay that we use this sign. There are signs in our own histories that we're like, I don't want to see that sign ever, right? I think ultimately where you started the question around the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment is also about like, brings us back to this question in a way that's not just about like what feels right for us as anti-Zionist Jews, like do we reclaim the symbol, do we not, but also really reckoning with whether we like it or not, that symbol means something very violent to Palestinians and other people who are impacted by Zionism. So again, to me, not worth it to do something that my Palestinian friends, comrades, allies, organizers are going to be like, whoa, that symbol was on the bulldozer that destroyed my home, you know? So yeah, that's where I land on that.
Yes, thank you. Like that is, I feel very similarly, and I'm not even going to try to hide it. Like that, it doesn't matter sometimes, like at the end of the day, what our experience is with it. If it has traumatized like large groups of people, we give it up. I mean, it's very hard for me too, though, because like I know there was a video going around. I think it wasn't even in Gaza. I think it was in the West Bank where like an Israeli soldier took over a mosque and like started reciting prayer over like Hebrew prayer over the loudspeaker to like be like, we have this now and this is ours. And I was like, well, am I gonna give up all liturgy now? Because like of course we all have to draw the line somewhere to be like, yeah, Zionists co-opt our lifestyle, our way of life. Like they co-opt Judaism. And do they get everything? No, of course not. But there is like a hard thing, and Hebrew is one where I feel about that too. Like the violence that the language, the modern language of Hebrew has, like, and people want to be like, no, I think it can be redeemed. And I'm like, oh. So I am always negotiating that. I'm really grateful you spoke on that. And to kind of think about what it would mean to like put these symbols and these languages that have sustained our people in some way or been used against us in some ways, like to bed, or like to put it away for the rest of our existence. Maybe that would bring a lot of grief, and like what you're saying about people's safety systems and feeling that grief. And so in chapter 3, I loved the way that you articulated this. You said that like we have a cultural fear of embracing endings and grieving, and you wrote, embracing death, endings, and all the boundaries in between is a small but important part of decolonizing our relationships to each other and the land. So how could embracing endings help us decolonize our relationships?
Well, when I think about colonization in the US and that as sort of like the birth of racial capitalism in the US, I think about capitalism as an endless cycle of production, and the way that there's an expectation that everything lives forever, right? That everything just keeps going, growing, bigger, bigger, more. So there's this sort of fear and turning away from endings and death, while in actuality, that fear and turning away from death causes so much death and destruction, right? If we orient to the earth as an endless resource, we are going to kill the earth. So there's these colonial views and colonial ways of relating to the land. I think part of undoing that is really zooming out and being like, how do I be with endings? How do I be with death in the way I relate to my body, right? Like there's so many colonial views around aging and beauty that were, all the anti-aging products and things that were made to believe we're supposed to stay young forever, and like beauty is looking young, and the sort of disrespect of aging and elderhood, and not always especially in a lot of like white European colonial cultures, really not having reverence for ancestors, not even knowing who ancestors are. So I find that exploring my own relationships to endings, to loss, to death really shift, yeah, especially like how I relate to the land. Like we need things to compost, we need things to regenerate. We also need that in our movements. Like I see a lot of that playing out of like there is that sort of colonial capitalist view of like, okay, even in our movements, there's this expectation of like, we're just going to keep campaigns over. Great. Next one. Meetings over. Next thing. Actions over. What are we doing next? Like we are so in that first part of the cycle way more of the time than we are in the like, let's complete, let's actually reflect. let's pause and like give space before, and I catch this in myself all the time. Like I just finished a training this weekend, leading a training, and found myself so quick to be like, okay, so like next time we should try this and this and this. And it was like, let me pause and just let that be complete. Give a little bit of space before I figure out the next thing. And I think in organizations and communities where I've seen people be able to do that, also I'm now thinking about like in intimate relationships. Like I'm definitely a believer of like, you just got out of the 3-year relationship, take a breath, like do you have fun, do your thing, but like take a moment to be with that ending before you move into something else. So I think that pause feels really crucial on the like personal level, on intimate levels, and on a systemic level of decolonizing our relationships to our bodies and each other.
In my like full-time work, I'm a therapist and I work in a clinic. And so reading the sections of the book about polyvagal theory and the ones that are like, I mean, yeah, that it is somatic therapy is something that I just did not know that much about, but have always been like so drawn to. And so even like for my professional practice, I was like taking notes, literally was reading, and like the next day in a session used like one of the things that you had brought up in a chapter in a session. And like, by the way, it went great. So it just like was very, very applicable on more levels than one. And like, I think it is really important that we start to bring in more embodied practice and somatics to the like traditional therapy fields. And I'm certainly not like a traditional therapy person, but like, yeah, we just need to like open it up a bit. So that being said, obviously I loved chapters like chapter 4 that talks a lot about polyvagal theory, which details how our bodies and our world are not made up of these individual parts, but are rather parts of an interconnected whole. You write about how trauma impacts our bodies and how somatic practice can support us in moving through activation. Something that you say specifically is whether engaging in activating conversations to organize people around anti-Zionism or in healing your own trauma, somatic practices can support our bodies to discharge, activate, and move stuck energy so we have more agency in our lives and relationships. I think so many anti-Zionist Jews feel this activation when conversing with Zionist Jews and Zionists in general, Jews or not Jews. And I'm curious if you can share practices that have been supportive to you in having these conversations.
There's so many different practices that I find useful around this. I'll say the first one is just a boundary practice of like really being intentional with our energy. Like the deciding point of like, is engaging with this person going to make me more free? Is engaging with this person going to make Palestinians more free? If the answer is no across the board, you walk away. And there's many somatic practices that help to have boundaries, to say no. One of my favorite somatic practices is called the let go by, where you just practice someone moving towards you and you sort of like step aside and they just move right past you. Of like, how can we sort of be that like Jedi that can transform energy and dodge the things that really aren't in service? There's a lot of reactionary Zionists out there who are really actually just gonna try to like suck your energy. Like I said, if at the end of that conversation, nobody gets more free, I would say practice a boundary, practice saying no, practice walking away. And, that can vary depending on who that is. So in some of the boundary work that we teach, it's like there's the push away decline. That's a like, no, fuck you. There's a intimate decline that's like, you are my mother or you are my lover, and I actually am really committed to staying in relationship with you. And for the sake of that, I need to say no to this, whatever that is, that conversation, that moment. There's a redirect no, which is like more of an engaged no, but might be like, oh, you're coming at me with, do you support Hamas? I'm going to redirect and try to find a way to connect around what are our shared values of freedom. So there's different ways that we can decline, that we can move conversations and lead people in the direction towards freedom, towards a collective liberation framework. And then I would say if you are in the redirect, or if you're in a yes, if for whatever reason you're like, actually, this is a really strategic person or institution or moment to engage with this Zionist, which there are those moments, and we do have to engage and we do have to mobilize our people, that one of the foundational practices that I learned through politicized somatics is this practice called the grab practice, or many of us have renamed it the pressure practice, because grab is just too much of a word. In that practice, you just get the repetition of those moments, right? So it's another like pressure, activation. You get to feel in your body, what does my body do when someone says something that just sets me off the rails, right? I've had a long journey with my family. I grew up in very like progressive Jewish community in the Bay Area, and very progressive until Palestine. And that was one of the tensions that I really, as a young kid, was just like, I don't understand why we oppose the state, why we protest outside of prisons, why we go to the MLK march every year in San Francisco, but we can't apply those same values of justice and freedom for Palestine. And so engaged in a lot of conversations with my family over the years, and I can say that they've definitely moved a lot from those, which I'm very grateful for. And there were those things that just would hook me, like particularly the sort of coming at me with like, oh, so you actually don't care about Jews, right? That conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism was just so painful for me over the years, because truly out of my family, I have 2 siblings, I'm like, I'm very connected to my Jewishness. And it was through anti-Zionism. It was really through anti-Zionism and queer Jewish community that I became connected to my Jewishness. It wasn't my Zionist Jewish day school. It wasn't my Zionist congregation. It was the communities that actually shared all of the values that helped me see ways my Jewishness could be part of my life, could be part of my commitments. So that's also say that's a point of pressure. That's one of the hooks for me. And so there's practices where you can actually in a partner practice, and I describe this in the book a little bit. It's an amended version, because a lot of these things I'm like, I don't want to encourage people to just go out there and like practice with your mom or practice even with your friend and not have the support and infrastructure and community to hold you in that practice. But just for the sake of describing it, it's like you can have someone move towards you and say that thing, right? What is that thing that's going to throw you off and you're not going to be able to stay present and connected in that conversation? And the first step is just to notice your response. So when you get hooked, when you get activated, what happens? Do you check out? Do you get defensive? Do you try to appease? What are the different responses that you notice arising in your body? And then through understanding those automatic responses, we can bring more agency to say, okay, that's how I might automatically respond. And for the sake of my commitment, for the sake of this relationship, what is this more centered way of engaging? And so that's where we have the like pressure, center, and face. So first, just notice the pressure, and then notice the pressure, recenter in your body. So find the dimensions, length, width, depth. That's another practice that I go through in the book. Find that center, and then turn back in to face that moment, face that activation, face that conversation. And through repetition, I haven't seen anyone not change or transform through that. And not because it's like, oh, this is the healing potion and there's some magic that happens. It's just that quite literally, if we practice things, we are training our bodies, we are creating neural pathways so that when that happens, again, we have a pathway to follow. So the next time someone says, oh, you're anti-Zionist, so you must hate Jews, I notice the anger, I notice the defensiveness, I recenter, and I can say, here's why I care about Jews and why that's actually connected to my fight to end Zionism, right? Because Zionism makes Jews less safe. Zionism isolates Jews. That could be an entry point to then also talking about, the primary impacts of Zionism on Palestinians and Arabs in the region. So lots of different somatic practices, I think, that can bring us into deeper relationship with ourselves, our people, and our movements.
Thank you so much for taking us through some of the like practical suggestions of how to move in these moments when we're feeling our own defensiveness and our own anger rising, and we have to kind of check in with ourselves before talking with others who we, as you noted, like might really care about and might really want to stay in community with. And so I appreciate it because sometimes I feel the discourse is either cut off all your loved ones or love them exactly as they are, and there's not a lot of room in between. So I really appreciate that analysis. And I'm curious because you share a little bit about your experience in parts of the book, and so much of this though is grounded in how we have to transform ourselves in order to dismantle systems and in order not to like reproduce the harmful effects of these systems on our fellow organizers, on the people we love. What has your own process of self-transformation looked like, and how can we move from self-transformation to community transformation for collectivism and interdependence?
I appreciate the way that you framed that, because I feel like there can be, in a lot of spaces, the idea of like, okay, so like first we learn to take care of ourselves, then we can take care of others. Or first we learn to love ourselves and then we can love others. And I'm like, that's just not how it goes. Like, we are not linear beings, and these are lifelong commitments to learn to love and to live. And so we got to do it all at once. So I think that's, in a way, part of what the book is really asserting, is that like self-transformation cannot happen without collective transformation, and collective transformation cannot happen without self-transformation. So really bringing those together, in the sense of self-transformation can't happen without collective transformation, is really the acknowledgement that we are so impacted by our collective conditions. I think one of the pitfalls of individualized models of therapy and healing can be that we take people out of their contexts and are looking at these like individualized bodies and individualized systems of like, oh, you are suffering from depression, when it's like, let's zoom out a few layers and really understand what are the conditions that are shaping that person, right? Do they have access to their basic needs? And I'm not just talking about housing or food. I'm also talking about dignity and safety and belonging. And then I think that for the collective transformation can't happen without self-transformation, is that our collectives are made up of ourselves, right? They're made up of many of us. And there's a sort of fractal way that we can impact change and scale up from the ways that we treat ourselves, the ways that we treat each other, and the ways that can really build more resilient and powerful movements, and the ways that the more resilient and powerful movements that we create change, we create that transformation on a collective, even global scale. So that's more of the kind of like theory behind the book. And my own process of transformation, since a young age, I was really, very quote unquote sensitive kid, very impacted by my environment, also very spiritual. Like, I felt more spiritual then than I do now, I would say. and that part of me is still still in there. But there was a point at which, actually, after returning from spending time in Palestine and living through some of just my own experiences of harm and violence while I was there, doing solidarity organizing, and then also, of course, just the witnessing the level of violence and suffering, I came back and felt really like shattered. I felt like I was shattered into pieces. And going back to the earlier question, was like seeing these symbols, whether it was the Star of David or different prayers, or, you know, very visibly Jewish people enacting violence as settlers in the West Bank. Literally, in one point, an Israeli settler in Hebron was trying to take land from a Palestinian family that I was helping to harvest olives with. And he held up, when the Palestinian family was like, "We have the deed to this land. This is our land." The settler held up the Torah and said, "We have the deed to this land." And it just broke me. I was just like, how do I reconcile that these like deeply seated values and practices? I didn't grow up in a very religious family, but I grew up in a very, very culturally Jewish family. And though I am connected to those parts of myself and my people and my ancestors, and just so many levels of feeling really undone by my time there. And that was actually when I started doing somatics. So I sought out a somatic practitioner, and I remember going in and being like, I know that, or I thought I knew that if I touch the deeper levels of hurt and pain, I won't come out of it. Like, it felt unsurvivable to touch that level of ancestral grief, of the trauma of witnessing so much violence, of experiencing harm. And the person I was working with, I remember being like, first of all, created a really safe space in many ways. And then also just invited a sort of curiosity, like a more plate, like, what if it was survivable? What if we tried just for this hour to see, to experiment? And literally, we did actually a bodywork session. So one of the parts of through the lineage of generative somatics that I learned was hands-on, was touch work. And we did one session, and I swear to you, I walked out of there like feeling whole. And I'm not saying that everything was healed and everything was better, because again, if we zoom out, many of the conditions that I was grieving were still happening. But there was a sense of returning to myself, a sense of returning to my safety that I could feel through her touch, through her presence, through my own breath, and really through the experience of just touching it, right? It was an hour. It's not like we got to everything, but just touching it and surviving that. So it created this kind of groundwork for me to know there's no part of me that is untouchable. There's no part of me that is too shameful. There's no part of me that is inherently bad or wrong. So I don't need to hide from myself. I don't need to hide from my people. Like, I can actually turn and face, I can turn towards those parts with curiosity. And that from there, right, I can find my wholeness, and I can find my freedom, and I can more valuably contribute to the things that I care about. I know for me, in times that I've been more acutely suffering, like I get so small. Like, it's so hard to actually participate in my community, to make contributions that I want to be making, because I feel so small. Somatics and embodied practice, movement. Also, like, again, when I say embodied practice, I'm including like really fucking good queer dance parties that I've gone to that have been the source of this place of like, I belong and my body is whole and my body is perfect just how it is. Those are some of the places and moments that have been really crucial to my own transformation.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us and being vulnerable with that. Yeah, I think that's incredibly powerful. What you said about like there is no part of me that is untouchable is deeply important, and also like so not the normal messaging that we receive in the society that we live in, and like yeah, is a lifelong learning process that is like incredibly transformative. um we've touched on so many different things during our time together, and you have so many beautiful messages to give to our listeners, to our communities. But if you could leave our listeners with one final message, what would it be?
My message would be feeling into what we just were talking about is like find something you care about and don't just fight for it, live for it. Like our movements need all of us, all the parts of us, and not just certain parts of us. There were so many times that I realized I was tucking away parts of myself, whether around my own disability or chronic health, or just different pieces that we hide away because we think we have to be a certain something to. And ultimately, that's really a disservice to our present time organizing and definitely to future generations. So I would say find the places that you can bring yourself, practice in those places, make mistakes, give it your all, and when you can, have a good fucking time while you're doing it.
Thank you so much. I think that is a perfect message to end on. And we're so appreciative of your time and all of your wisdom. And I could not recommend more that everyone reads your book, which the link will be in the show notes. Truly, I think anyone reading it is going to get at least something from a part of it. So we really appreciate you being here with us and talking to us about it. And we're excited to be in community.
Me too. Thank you so much for these genius questions and guiding me. It was so sweet.
Thanks for listening to Making Menches. As an explicitly anti-Zionist grassroots org, we don't receive any institutional funding or support. Please consider supporting our work by funding us. You can find the donation link on our website, makingmenches.com. You can follow us on Instagram at Making Menches. We host monthly Shabbats both in person and online, so make sure to sign up for our newsletter, which is on our website, to get updates.
Making Menches, the podcast, is produced by Eliana Rubin and Jesse Sander. Intro music is by Nate Sander. Editing by Jesse Sander.